In a world with so many movies to choose from, one hero will rise. Ladies and gentlemen,
the Movie Wire podcast
with Justin Henson.
Fragile. It must be Italian.
I'm Buddy the Elf.
We're gonna have the happiest Christmas.
Merry Christmas, you filthy animal, and a Happy New Year.
Oh my God, I shot my eye out.
I give you the Griswold family Christmas.
I say bah, humbug.
Welcome to this week's edition of The Movie Wire. I'm your host, Justin Henson, and welcome to the show. We have had a huge movie week, and given that fact, a big chunk of the show will be dedicated to two movies, including one of the most anticipated movies of the year that's 13 years in the making. This week on the show, it's been 13 years since we visited the world of Pandora, and now it's finally here in the sequel to 2009's Avatar, in Avatar: Way of the Water, and a film that encourages to capture every moment in life and not only give us a peek into the youth of Steven Spielberg, but shows us the magic of why movies are such a big part of our life in Steven Spielberg's new film, The Fabelmans. Ready for my verdict? Let's get into it.
Out of the windows, what? A roar and a burst of flame. The Movie Wire podcast
With Justin
meet people like me.
The podcast for hot and trendy movies.
The Wire.
and here we go.
It's been 13 years since the record-breaking original Avatar came out, and now Jake Sully returns and lives with his newfound family, formed on the extrasolar moon of Pandora. A once familiar threat returns to finish what was previously started. Jake must work with the Na'vi to protect their home and Jake's family in Avatar: Way of the Water.
I went to the studio and I said, let's not just do another movie. Let's swing for the fences.
I think what people are in store for is Avatar, but timed 100. It takes it to a whole other place.
I've never seen anything like this in a movie. It picks up where it left off, and he just...
It was wild. My eyes were glued to the screen, and I can't wait for people to see it.
The world is bigger. The stakes are higher.
This is our home!
I was always looking at everything in wonder.
What Jim is trying to create is very truthful, very emotional and grounded tales.
I need you to be strong.
A family trying to survive.
Strong-hearted.
It's really got this level of magic and crazy.
It takes years to make these movies, but there's nothing like this.
It was the experience of the first movie, but on steroids. The first film was a discovery of the forest, a discovery of Pandora on your Banshee.
Outstanding.
It was unlike anything any of us had ever seen. And now it's the Way of Water. And it's a world all on its own. And I felt like I was rediscovering Pandora all over again.
One of the things I love about this film is that you're introduced to the kids. And the story, of course, is about how the family will change.
Alien, that's all they see.
I see.
And that's what Jim's very good at. He's very good at upping the ante. He's very good at, well, we're going to add children into this love story. We're going to increase the planet and what we see of it. If you think you're going in and seeing a rehash of the first movie, it's not, it's an extension.
What does Ava's heartbeat sound like?
Mighty.
Wherever we go, this family is our fortress.
Now, before we get into the review, I just want to talk about James Cameron for a second. This is a creator that's not like any other creator that doesn't have 100 different films of blockbusters. He has been very strategic in the projects he takes on. Many know him from his classic works such as the Terminator 1 and 2, The Abyss, Aliens, Titanic, and of course the Avatar films, with 2 of his movies in the top 5 for biggest box office success of all time. And who knows if Avatar Way of the Water will join the list. At the time of writing this review, the film has been released for the weekend and has already grossed over $400 million. And I have to tip my hat to James Cameron, and I wish I could shake his hand at the level of commitment he has on taking some of the most challenging projects and the level of dedication he puts into them. We take projects like Titanic, Aliens, The Abyss, and Avatar. There's a sense of challenge that even the audience can see while watching the film. And even if some of his movies are not your cup of tea, there is still a level of respect that can be given to taking a movie that holds so many challenges for special effects artists and even the cast. Each of his movies show a level of heart and dedication to them. Now, James Cameron, he is a visionary creator and loves to explore as we see that persona in some of his themes in the movies surrounding technology, and he gives audiences groundbreaking visuals that we haven't seen before. In 2009, we saw the same thing with breathtaking colors and visuals with a 3D format that breathed new life into theaters. I was skeptical and a tad curious on what Cameron was going to bring to the table with Avatar Way of the Water, with again part of my policy of doing as little to no research in a film before I view. I wanted my senses to tell me, just like a majority of the audience that go into this movie, the most noticeable thing audiences will see besides the beautiful CGI created environment is the motion. Some will automatically think this is trickery of the camera movement, and at first I was unsure of what I felt about how the film was being seen. There was something of a smooth but soap opera feel, but bigger, like I was watching a beefed up big budget soap opera shooting style. Now, this doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Those of you that have played around with your TV settings may have noticed some motion settings that make your content move with a smooth camera pan that just seems too smooth and seemed pretty cool at first, but then it just comes across as distracting with a lot of movies you watch. If you're listening and like me, frame rate on TVs and how the TV interprets color and even has a filmmaker mode is everything to me. I like to see the filmmaker's intent when I go to the theater and when I'm home. And when we see the frame rate change in a film, you might not know what's happening, but you feel the change in what your eyes are perceiving. And what the creators decide as their frame rate in film is more important than people think. Normally, a film is shot in 24 frames per second. This is what audiences are accustomed to. This is what we're used to. Now, when you get that smooth soap opera feel to your TV or movie, this is where we kind of get the 30 frames per second and it gets to the soap opera feel. And your mind is telling you this is kind of cool, but it doesn't feel right. Even at times, depending on the content of the scene, the film can take away from the story and become distracting as the film can look too real. James Cameron's 3D in this one isn't as hard-hitting to the market as it once was in his original film, but instead he experiments with an experimental 48 frames per second, which is the first film of its kind to be shot this way, and he adds some modifications to its detailing to keep its cinematic feel without feeling too distracting. Now, Way of the Water doesn't put all of its shots in 48 frames per second. In more dramatic scenes where we see the character focus, you can really see Cameron dial the frame rate back to ensure the characters are the focus and there are no distractions. By Cameron picking and choosing his frame rates helps create a real immersion into his storytelling, and for the most part, it is extremely effective, at least for the first half of the movie. Now, with all that background said, let me kick off the review with saying that me and the Avatar movies haven't had a stream of good luck. When the first Avatar came out, I showed up to the theater about 30 minutes early thinking that I was going to get a good seat. But just like all other people eager to see it, everybody was at the theater, that I ended up in a couple of the rows in front, only to have the projector break down in the middle of the movie. After about a week, I attempted the movie again, only to have the same film projector issues again, and the film projector broke down. Eventually, after the third attempt, I was able to get a decent seat and see the movie in its entirety. Now, fast forward 13 years, I can walk into my local theater picking my new chosen seats that I didn't have the luxury back in 2009. I was able to have a comfortable experience as we got into about 2 hours of Avatar Way of the Water. The film went into glitch mode and the screen went black, where the manager had to come in and explain the film's new experimental frame rate has created some issues with some of the screenings. My first thought is, James Cameron, you're killing me with these Avatar movies. So that very next morning, I attempted the film again with the same exact issue, only this time it was 30 minutes before the movie ended. So later that night, I went into another showing, crossing my fingers, and hallelujah, this one made it to the end. Now, normally this wouldn't be an issue, but the film does run after previews about 3.5 hours. So my time investment into screening this movie was just about 9 hours. And some audience members might steer away from just having the 3.5 hour. And some audience members might steer away from just seeing it for 3.5 hours. And they might prefer to wait for its streaming to see it from the comfort of their own home, given the runtime. So the big question, is Avatar Way of the Water worth the runtime? Let me just say this, I wasn't blown away by the first film. Yes, the 3D and the visuals were good, the characters were okay, but the story and script didn't match the obvious time spent on making it a spectacle of itself. It was a predictable plot at times, stale dialogue, and when it comes to the substance of everything, other than the special effects, we have seen it all before. Avatar was James Cameron's true experiment to the extreme, so extreme that the story suffered. His focus went somewhere else instead of having a good foundation to build his vision upon. It was treated as a theater ride versus a true movie-going experience. But I did enjoy it for what it was, but I wasn't blown away by it. I gave it originally 2.5 stars. What the first Avatar really suffered in was giving us true depth and exploration to its characters, an original plotline, and something other than the filmmakers saying, "Look what I can do," and banking on the spectacle versus the substance. Now here we are 13 years later, and here is the sequel, Avatar Way of the Water. There is still an element of the look what I can do formula, but it was justified because I was actually impressed on the awe of mainly the frame rate and how it was added to the environment, and really immersed myself into what I would describe as a jaw-dropping theatrical experience when it comes to its visuals and settings. I remember I was impressed with the visuals of the first one, but not enough where it stood with me for very long after the movie. This is truly something audiences have never seen before, and it is very impressive, at least for the first half. And I will get into the second half in just a minute. Now, we are joined by our returning cast, Sam Worthington as Jake, Zoe Saldana as Nitri, Sigourney Weaver as Kiri, and Stephen Lang as Quaritch, with again James Cameron at the helm of directing, and alongside his writing credit adds a married writing team, Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, who wrote the 2020 Mulan, In the Heart of the Sea adaptation, Jurassic World, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and a screen adaptation of the 1997's film The Relic, which is surprising to me that Cameron took on additional writers onto this project with how protective he is to his vision. But this works in his benefit, and I'm glad he did. The problem I had to the first Avatar again was more spectacle over substance. The writing in the story was a backseat to Cameron's CGI overload. The dialogue in the story came in second to the visuals we had on screen. There is a noticeable difference between what we hear on the screen this go around, and instead of just getting a visual playground for the eyes, we have more depth to the characters that we can hear to support the world that our characters are in. Now, the dialogue isn't perfect, and there are a couple lines that just seem out of place during the film, and it lingers like you're talking loudly at a concert with a friend, and then the music stops and everybody in the room can hear what you're saying. There's a scene where we see a scuffle with a few of our young characters, and we hear the B word get dropped, and it's delivered and said with intent and vulgarity, and it comes across like it just doesn't belong. There are a few instances through the movie we get lines like this that we can see a bit of inconsistency, and we wonder where these kids learned this language. We can only assume it came from our original human Jake, but given how his character is written, it seems out of character for this vulgarity from him. I bring this specific example up because it's a sign of the differential from the writing styles that you can see shine through in the movie. But when we look holistically, this team helped more than hurt. Jaffa and Silver alongside Cameron, we can tell added an elevated element to the story and depth to the characters that really show us the awe in the environment of Pandora, and not treating Pandora as the crutch to hold up the movie. Avatar Way of the Water is mostly successful in this aspect, but again, at times the visuals, as pretty as they can be a distraction from the spoken words, and as a viewer can be lost in translation as we are watching the visually stunning images on screen. Now, Avatar Way of the Water said and done after the trailers can run about 3.5 hours, and that's a big commitment for audiences to endure. The big question is that does the film have enough here to justify such a long runtime? The answer is yes and no. It's not too far off the mark. The film does have some filler scenes in it that gives off the look what I can do aspect and doesn't really add anything to the story, including some scenes with these whale-like creatures called the Tolkien that the Na'vi have a bond with. And we have scenes of conversation between the Na'vi and the Tolkien that I felt was out of place, and it just didn't fit. Not just the creatures, more specifically the conversation piece of it, which wasn't consistent and just came across weird. Avatar could have cut about 20-30 minutes off of its runtime easily without ruining key moments that damage the story. But with that said, for a movie over 3 hours, having enough material and vision to only question 20 to 30 minutes is a cinematic win in my book, especially we are more invested into these characters this time around. Cameron and his writing team was very smart when it comes to the balance and the emotional offering it has to the audience. Cameron and his writing team were smart when it comes to the balance and the emotional offering it has to the audience in the first half of the movie to ensure we get a true exploration of the environment and build up of our characters, because as we get into the second half, Cameron starts to lean into that spectacle more than substance act, only on a higher scale where we feel like we're getting into almost a virtual reality ride at Disneyland, where we almost see through our Na'vi characters during underwater scenes or action scenes. It comes across a little theme parky, and that doesn't mean it doesn't look good. It still looks stunning. Everything in the Avatar Way of the Water looks stunning, so don't get me wrong there. And all the mentioned aspects that I've just covered are overshadowed by the absolute energizing experience this film has to offer. This is a movie that is meant to spend your money on to enjoy on the big screen. I've talked about the film-going experience numerous times on the show, where we look up at the screen in awe, where we are invested in the characters we see, the story it tells. This is the movie that checks all the boxes and what we would want from an outing at the theater. We travel to a new world and environment, we have characters we genuinely like to watch on screen, and we have a slight touch of almost a childlike nostalgia that doesn't overstay its welcome. And walking out of the theater, we have seen something we haven't seen before. Avatar Way of the Water does something magical for me. Even though majority of the film is shot in a CGI environment, it almost learns its lessons from the first film on the importance of character development, and at times I felt like I was being greedy. What I didn't like about the first film, Cameron fixes in this sequel, but there are times we visit a new environment where I wish we could have seen more specifically the human bases, as we see humans called the Sky People. They return to the planet of Pandora. They speak of rebuilding almost a new city to reside in. And I wanted to see more of these Sky People's dwellings and the way they live as they return to Pandora, or what the Sky People did while they were hanging out all those years on Pandora. The movie uses these pieces as just brief plot drivers as it focuses back on the main focal points of Pandora. This is where the film at its runtime could have cut out some of the unnecessary things and given us the best of both worlds. As we visit the Sky People's way of life, even though they are villains of the film, I still wanted to see the cool technology and what they've been up to all these years, to give us kind of that foundation of build so we can actually see them as a true threat. This is where Way of the Water loses a little bit of its focus and makes it more apparent that it really wants to show off its other world of imagination, and not the old boring military and robots, but there's a curiosity that we want to see what humans have done over all these years, and what things are different that they've brought to the table versus the first one. I want to see some creativity of evolution of the humans that have been absent from years from the planet. Avatar Way of the Water is for sure an achievement more so than its predecessor, and a much better movie. It gives audiences that decide to invest their money and their time to an exciting movie-going experience, and introduces us to something new that we haven't seen before. Now, some little kids that you take this movie might get a little bored at the runtime and the slower movements. It's not an action-packed 3 hours. It will keep you entertained for an adult based on the substance and the plotline and the visuals, but little kids not so much. This is where Avatar might lose some ticket sales in its runtime versus the first one, of parents not wanting to take their kids to an over a 3.5 hour movie. But I'm sure it'll make it up because this one is absolutely rewatchable. I'm sure audiences will go into this movie multiple times. The first Avatar created a memorable experience whether you're sitting in the back row or front row. It makes an experience based on the 3D and visuals that it offers to the audience. When it comes to Avatar Way of the Water, this one completes a full circle of a memorable theater experience, as long as the projectors work. And it is absolutely worth the ticket price. When it comes to the follow-up sequels that are already in the works, Way of the Water doesn't give us any edge-of-your-seat obvious hints, but rather gives us a spider web of ideas that the films can really take us to in the incoming sequels. And leaving the theater, I was racking my brain to see what Cameron was going to come up with next to really top this one in terms of story, technical achievement, and where the Na'vi is going to take us next. Avatar Way of the Water is a film that will stay with you well after it's done, will put a sense of wonder and a childlike awe on your face. It is a huge improvement over its previous film. This is a film unlike the first one that if you took away all the visuals and CGI, you didn't get anything very interesting. With Avatar Way of the Water, you strip down the special effects, you still have a good character base, a good story, and enough to keep you entertained by the dialogue and characters. This is one of those sequels that James Cameron took what people liked about the first one, took it up a notch, and those that were missing more meat to the bones of the first one, he gives that to the audience to chew on as well. This is a film-going experience not to miss on the big screen, especially with the increased frame rate that you might not be sure of at first, but as the film goes on, you find yourself as part of Pandora. I'm giving Avatar: Way of the Water 3 stars. Now, before we get into the rest of the show, it just seems like it's been the last couple of episodes, the last couple of weeks that I reviewed a couple of movies that already hit streaming. And it has only been a couple of weeks, but I'll list them anyway. Don't forget to check out my reviews for movies that just hit streaming and are available to rent or buy now. Just in time for Christmas, Santa is coming to town to kick some criminals' butts and to check some off the naughty list in A Violent Night that got 2.5 stars Under the Tree, a charming love story that shows love never stops surprising you even though you know how it ends in Spoiler Alert that got a loving 3 stars, a unique coming-of-age story that is beautiful as you can get when it comes to a cannibalistic couple that falls in love in Bones and All that received 3 stars. One of my favorite films of the year, one that I predict will come out with the most Oscar nominations, is The Banshee of Inisherin, which received an absolutely perfect 4 stars. And finally, Cate Blanchett gives a powerhouse of a performance as she plays a composer and maestro that has shadows fall upon her life in Tar, which conducted its way to 3.5 stars. You can find those reviews on my previous episodes, and just a reminder, if you haven't yet, make sure you hit follow or subscribe and leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. And make sure you follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd at Movie Wire Show. And some quick news before we continue the show. I am excited to announce that I will be returning once again to my good friend Antonio on the Cult-Worthy podcast to bring in the new year. That episode will be announced soon, so make sure you follow the Cult-Worthy podcast and stay tuned for that episode coming out soon. In the last couple of episodes, I talked about my appearance on the Talking Smack podcast, and it's finally available to listen to. This is where I joined the Talking Smack podcast to go more into depth into James Cameron's career and do a more deep dive into Avatar: Way of the Water. It's an incredibly fun episode that everybody needs to check out, and make sure you subscribe to the Talking Smack podcast. I will put a link in the description of this episode. Now let's take a listen to Josh over the Talking Smack podcast.
Do you love comics, movies, video games, and more? We do too. Join me, Josh Scar, and my cast of colorful co-hosts on Talking Smack. Look for our yellow and red icon on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, and other podcast players.
Growing up in a post-World War II era, living in Arizona, young Sammy Fabelman aspires to become a filmmaker as he reaches adolescence, but soon discovers a shattering family secret and explores how the power of films can help him see the truth around him and in himself in the new Steven Spielberg film, The Fabelmans.
Movies are dreams that you never forget.
Sammy?
The lights change how everything looks. It's hard to find our house.
Ours is the dark house with no lights.
In this family, it's the scientists versus the artists. Sammy's on my team, takes after me.
What kind of movie are we gonna make?
You dismiss what he does. It's playful or imaginative. You could afford to be a little encouraging.
She should have been a concert piano player. What she got in her heart is what you got.
You can't just love something, you also have to take care of it. It's more important than your hobby.
Can you stop calling it a hobby?
Mom got a monkey.
Why'd you get a monkey?
Because I needed a laugh.
You always have to be the center of attention?
Stop shouting at her!
That has been nothing but disrespect from you. I'm your mother!
Family, art. It'll tear you in two.
You stop making movies, it'll break your mother's heart.
I don't know what to do anymore.
You do what your heart says you have to.
What was your favorite part?
Now, we have all had that moment or experience, if you will, that when we go to a movie, we have a sense of euphoria and a little bit of awe that sweeps across our face in pure amazement and wonderment, mostly as we are kids, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's during your first movie-going experience. And the movie is going to be different for everybody. I remember I was 11 when I got my first sense of wonderment from film, but it wasn't just the film that helped lead to this. It was the experience following up to it. I remember checking the showtimes on the Seattle Times newspaper. I remember the experience from the parking lot to the long ticket sales line to standing in line to get into the theater. This was the film Jurassic Park. I remember receiving the original book as a birthday gift back in 1992, which I must have read back to back and cover to cover until the film adaptation came out, which again was also directed by Steven Spielberg. And the book helped lead to my excitement of seeing this film, but there was also a sense of fear of what I was going to see. At times it was hard to differentiate the difference between the excitement or fear. As the lights went down in the theater to a sold-out audience, it was clear that my excitement took hold beyond fear. There's a scene that gave me this sense of awe and pinned a crossroads of film into my head, and it isn't a scene that most people would find a pivotal moment, or one that you think back to when you saw Jurassic Park. And it's not the initial introduction of the T-Rex, it isn't anything with the Velociraptors, but rather we have our corrupt park hacker Dennis Nedry speed towards the docks with his stolen dinosaur embryos. There's a sense of thrill if he's going to make it in time to only have his Jeep get stuck, only to be attacked by the venomous Dilophosaur, and we see Nedry escape to inside his Jeep to close the door. There's a sense of safety before we hear the rattling and the snarl of our prehistoric beast. And then the camera pans out to outside the Jeep just as Nedry screams bloody murder. And that was followed up by my father shaking me and saying boo right in my ear directly after it happens. I was left excited yet terrifying with so many emotions of thrill to this scene. This movie got me so excited for what I witnessed on screen, I thought it was so cool. I found myself afterwards reading the book yet again, and collecting as many dinosaur toys as I could, even building my own Jurassic Park out of cardboard and action figures. Movies have a way to bring out new feelings and emotions we didn't even know we could feel, and we usually see that at a younger age as we start to discover new experiences and discover how to handle our emotions. Steven Spielberg's new film, The Fabelmans, taps into the emotion in a way we haven't seen Spielberg before. In his semi-autobiographical story, this is a much different Spielberg that we haven't seen that introduces a more honest and raw version of storytelling that we aren't used to when it comes to Spielberg. There's almost something poetic on what Spielberg does here, especially when watching The Fabelmans. It reminded me of the sense of wonder we get from watching a film, and in my case I was reminded of Jurassic Park, and as we grow to discover more and more emotion on how to deal with our own emotions. This is where the magic of movies have played a big part in our lives and are able to tap into our emotional response. Now, this is where the magic of movies have played a big part in our lives and are able to tap into our emotional response. And also a reason why there are so many different tastes in movies, so many likes and dislikes of certain films, and of course different interpretations of how we view a film. Spielberg demonstrates this without spelling it out and requires the audience to just pay attention at our characters' facial expressions and body language on top of just the spoken word. It's almost like watching a silent film where the characters have to use over-featured moments and facial reactions. These facial expressions happen more in the adults than our kids because parents have this expectation to create a memory and experience and an emotional response just like film. The movie follows Sammy, played by Gabrielle LaBelle, from ages 7 to 8, and takes him through the moments from the first time he was taken to the theater by his mother and father, Mitzi and Bert Fabelman, played by Michelle Williams and Paul Dano, where outside the theater the parents explain to Sammy what he is about to see inside the theater. And with a child's unknown fear, Sammy isn't sure if he was going to like going to a moving picture show. But inside, we are met alongside Sammy with a darkened theater with the projector light shining like a magic wand onto the screen. with a shot of Sammy's face of pure child innocence of amazement as he watches a train robbery on screen. With that single shot of Sammy's face, it is the face of why theaters are so important, even more so today, as we more commonly nowadays hear adults cheer on the straight-to-streaming option as a form of convenience and the option to not spend that much money. We forget how that experience affects a lot of kids growing up to unlock the imagination and to pin that memory into their head. Taking kids away from the theater is like taking away Santa Claus away from a child's Christmas. Sammy soon becomes obsessed with shooting films and discovers he has a talent for practical effects and camera shots. As he lives his life through a lens, he starts to discover through a looking glass, if you will, a family that's struggling to find their happiness and sometimes captures the money shot of pure bliss. The film was also written by Spielberg and a frequent collaborator, Tony Kirshner, from West Side Story, Lincoln, and Munich, in which the pair does a fantastic job giving us a realistic and strategic dialogue of a traditional Jewish family during the times of World War II, without getting distracted to steer away from the vision and point that Spielberg is trying to portray. The film screams confidence and a laser focus to the point, and you can feel the heart and Spielberg's sweet kiss from his own experiences growing up in this movie. There are 2 films Spielberg has done where you can feel his emotion, love, and heart that went into every shot, every word, to even every character expression, where we feel his character direction is in top form. And that is Schindler's List and now The Fabelmans. As we see Sammy go throughout the film, we see his talent in making movies. We also see a crescendo of awkwardness and emotion from the parents that obviously have some marital issues and think they can hide it, not realizing that kids are smarter and more observant than they give them credit for. Especially with Sammy, one with an eye for shooting a story and getting the perfect shot. Parents Mitzi and Bert, again played by Williams and Dono, give 2 of the best performances of their career in this, and their characters think they are doing the best when it comes to protecting their kids by hiding the fact there are issues. This is where The Fabelmans is the most successful. It keeps the audience in the eyes of Sammy, where we have that awkward feeling from the interactions with Mitzi and Bert to the awkward looks and silence where we feel something is wrong, but we just don't know what. The film takes its time not to give more to the audience than it does to Sammy, so we can stay present with Sammy and his observations. The portrayal of the family during this time and the expectations of society and the vision of values of marriage during this era was in a stricter context than it is today. Now, you take today where everybody's dirty laundry is poured onto a social media platform for all to see. As the film moves on to the second half, these emotions increase, not just from our parents, but from Sammy. And all the emotions from the other characters are bottled up or withheld to almost stages of trying to create happiness by adding additional things that they think would help the happiness. But in reality, it adds to the weight of frustration, from more work to other love interests to a high school crush to adding a monkey to the household. By the time we get to the top of the crescendo, each of our characters have to eventually deal with their own happiness, to find a path in the crossroads to find that happiness. And what I can appreciate about the uniqueness of this storytelling here is that it doesn't get too caught up in the drama or aftermath of the confrontation, but rather each individual's pain and life's path. This is where you can really tell that Spielberg wanted to tell a story from the perspective of Sammy, on what he saw and understood growing up. There's a certain level of respect to each of the parents, Mitzi and Bert, even if you don't agree with their life's actions. But it again shows a view of how Sammy still has love for each one of his parents, but is unsure how to handle his emotion. And it is brilliantly, subtly handled. And as we see the level of respect Spielberg treats these 2 characters, and it is apparent that Spielberg treats these 2 characters with a level of respect, and can also be a tribute to his own parents that both had recently passed away. His mother passed away in 2017, and his father at the age of 103 passed away in 2020. in which both were divorced in 1966. He treats these characters as a son would respect and love his parents, even though he might not agree with the decision on their life's journey along the way. The Fabelmans is Spielberg's most raw and subtly emotional feat that won't necessarily make you shed a tear, but to understand the pain of growing up that doesn't follow the normal Spielberg formula, but rather a raw coming-of-age story with an honesty and a journey we take with our Fabelman family about the way we view and deal with emotion and how we even express it. It is a true sneak peek into the filmmaker and the love for the camera he has growing up. The performances you will fall in love with, more notably Paul Dano, who gives a performance of his career and will stay with you well after the film is over. I'm giving The Fabelmans 3.5 stars. And that's a cut on this week's edition of The Movie Wire. I want to thank you for listening and thank you for your support. You can also show support by subscribing to the show. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd at Movie Wire Show. Until next week, do me a favor, Make sure you stay for after the credit to show the respect to those that put their blood, sweat, and tears into making a feature film, and make sure you support your local movie theaters.
A verdict has been made on this episode of The Movie Wire by your host, Justin Henson. He thanks you for listening to the show. You can follow Justin on Instagram and Twitter at Movie Wire Show, or visit his website, www.themoviewire.com. Oh, and don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we will see you at the movies.
Thank you for bringing me to the movies.